Today in the FIDE World Cup we had the round one tiebreaks. There was plenty of drama, lots of ups and downs, so much action. But I'm going to focus on one particular match, and that's between Baro Jobava from Georgia, a home crowd favourite, and Ivan Salgado Lopez from Spain. They drew their first classical games pretty solidly. They then, in the tiebreaks, they played two 25-minute games. Those were also drawn, again, fairly solid games, and so they went into two 10-minute games. And this was the first of those 10-minute games. So Jobava with white, and, well, those of you that follow my videos will know that I'm a big fan of Jobava. He's not afraid to go his own way, and we saw that with his opening against Black's Sveshnikov variation. He played a very old move, knight d5, which doesn't have a particularly dangerous reputation. But it's not a bad way to play. It's pretty solid. But Jobava goes his own way a little bit. He doesn't play with c4. He advances his a-pawn as far as he can. And all he's doing is he's trying to use his queenside pawn majority. And, you know, this a-pawn clamps the b6 square. Of course, in the meantime, Black has counterplay on the other side of the board. But here's another of his ideas, rook a3. Nice move. It means that the rook can sometimes defend on the king side. Now, Black played in traditional fashion with e4. I wonder whether f4 is perhaps a decent move, because it blocks out this bishop and prevents white from defending with f4. It's an interesting move. Anyway, e4 played. I'm going to zip through these first moves fairly quickly because I want to get to the critical moment in the game. But you can see how white starts the clamp on the queen side, and this knight is very annoying. And now f4, nice move, and this really quells any counterplay for Black on the king side. And we can see this rook flies over beautifully, connecting with the king's rook, and this really means that Black is not going to be able to attack on the king side. White is incredibly well coordinated. Let me just reach this important position. So here we go. We can see that I think the opening has turned out very well for Jobava, because he has this wonderful clamp on the queen side, clamping the b6 square, but also looking at the d6 pawn. And it's certainly not easy for Black to develop here. You know, at the moment his rooks aren't connected. Instead of defending this pawn with, say, rook d8, which is rather passive, Salgado played bishop d7. It's an interesting idea, so that if knight takes d6, then actually he's going to get pretty decent counterplay with b6. And if, well, that can't be taken. If the queen steps back, then, you know, moves like rook b4 are coming, and yeah, it's quite unclear. Black certainly has counterplay there. So Jobava invested 2 minutes in this position and came up with rook e1. That, of course, preempts bishop b5, which is a bit of an annoying pin. And now I suppose that the normal move would be rook e8. And then I assume that Jobava would exchange. Now he's not winning a pawn, but he still has this wonderful clamp on the queen side. But instead Salgado decided to ditch a pawn, knight e4. I think he's hoping to sort of stir up counterplay on the f-file. I mean, if rook e4, then bishop b5 certainly isn't so clear. I think, you know, against weaker players, you could kid them. You know, many players would take this pawn, but suddenly it's not such a clear position. Obviously, if this pawn is taken, then there is a mate on f1. But it's not just that. I mean, that's the obvious one. But once the bishop comes to b5, then it makes room for the queen to come over to the f-file. And this position isn't so clear. But Jobava, very steady, just played b3. And now that the knight is protected, now he's threatening queen takes d6, and that's a different proposition. So off rook f6, and then he took on e4, and now he's in control. And well, that's what you want in these kind of rapid play games: control, the initiative, and control. And here, White certainly has that. His king is safe. There's no problem here, and White just has a very nice initiative. And Jobava wrapped things up very efficiently. Let's just see the end. So he's snaffled this important pawn on d6, and that queen is on a wonderful square, or I should say a wonderful diagonal, because from here it not only controls the important diagonal protecting the king, but also attacks down here and here. Black resigned. I thought that was a really nice positional game from Jobava, and yeah, as I said, kept control. So he's won the first 10-minute game. So Salgado was in a must-win situation. He had to win this second 10-minute game, and it's a very interesting opening. So Jobava with black. So it's a French defense, typical pawn structure. Queen threatening to take here. I guess Jobava didn't want to castle. He's probably worried about the queen moving to the side and then some rash attack with g4 coming, although it's not so simple to get in. In any case, Jobava, well, as is his wont, plays rook g8, so black can't castle on the king side. But he has an interesting idea. So rook e1, White building up nicely, queen b8. So this is his plan. Jobava would very much like to exchange queens, and then his king stands beautifully in the middle of the board, and, well, black is so solid there. But, of course, Salgado, wanting to win, keeps the queens on. And now, incredibly, g5 from Jobava. Remember, he only needs a draw to win the match, but he's still playing incredibly aggressively. So let's see what his big idea is. Well, I mean, obviously that pawn is pinned, but what happens on queen h3? I mean, this looks such a loose move. So, you know, don't forget, already there's something like rook takes e6 could be in the air. I suspect that this looks already absolutely devastating. But Jobava played queen takes pawn. He'd obviously calculated this, because at first it looks as though rook f1 is a winning move. But in fact, black can save himself with queen g4, played in 1 second, with 1 second's thought. So the point is that if rook takes knight here, then the rook is en prise. That's actually checkmate. So suddenly Salgado, looked a bit mystified. So he's a pawn down, but, well, he's, playing on, and the king is relatively safe on the queen side. Rook here, but white keeps his cool and plays on. There is still pressure on the f-file. Rook h8 hits the queen moves into the centre, and knight d7, and the queen flips over to the queen side. And now, still a tricky position. If the king defends the a-pawn, then f7 is en prise. And so Jobava plunges in with queen g2, and he's not afraid to mix it. Queen takes a7, but the knight defends pretty well. Rook h2, and there's counterplay here too. And knight b6. Still very tense position. Black is a pawn up, but white is very active here. And here, well, queen e2 is possible, but Jobava played queen e3, slightly surprising. Allowing bishop takes c6. And of course, moves like this, very difficult to defend against when you're running short of time. I repeat, this is a 10-minute game. They do get 10 seconds each time they make a move. However, not an easy position to play. Check, and here Jobava makes an error. He should step back, although it's not obvious that this is a correct move. Because in this position you just feel as though, well, White has got his pawn back. The queen is right in the black king's face. It doesn't look good. In fact, black is still fine here, incredibly. After this very important move, rook d7, defending the f-pawn, and sometimes black even gets counterplayed by switching the rook to the b-file. Remember, White has a few problems to deal with on the second rank. And black should be fine there, incredibly. But instead, after queen a7 check, instead of putting the king back, Jobava ran forward, and after queen takes knight, he's suddenly in desperate trouble. The rook attacked, the f-pawn attacked. He tried rook d7, but now queen b8 is fatal. The rook will be taken if the king moves. And after rook c7, rook f7, that is the end of that. No defense to taking the rook. He gave a check, but that was that. Jobava had to resign. So Salgado managed to level the match by winning that 10-minute game. So then they went into the next tiebreak round, which is 2 5-minute games. The first game of that mini match, blitz match, was drawn. In fact, Salgado was a pawn up, but Jobava managed to somehow claw his way back. So this is the second of the 5-minute games. Jobava with White. Roughly level opening. You can see that black has a beautiful knight on c5. And the queen is well placed on e6, but with a5, Jobava manages to complicate the position. Clearly that can't be taken because the knight is on prise. So this a-pawn needs some attention. So Salgado played rook a8. Now if a6, protected passed pawn, doesn't look bad, but then c6 undermines the support for the pawn. And black is okay there. So Jobava played knight c4, keeping his options open. He might push with a6. He might still capture on b6. And here Salgado was kind of phased. He convinced himself that a6 was a serious threat. But in fact, if he just, say, activates his knight, this pawn isn't going too far, and I think in particular when this knight on c5 is so well placed, it's very hard for white to achieve anything because this knight controls so many useful squares, and there is always the possibility later on to attack this pawn, which would, perhaps with the queen, which would undermine this a-pawn, and sometimes later on with the c-pawn as well. So in fact black will be okay there. But of course, when you're running short of time, it's very difficult to appreciate that. And Salgado decided better safe than sorry, and he took the a-pawn. But now, white has a very nice pawn structure. If that's taken, then queen takes c5. And black still has counterplay here, but you feel that this must be better for white because these pawns are so weak. But things went from bad to worse. After knight takes pawn, Salgado played knight d7, and now e5 check, and e5 is an excellent move. If that's taken, then queen e4 check is deadly, double attack. So queen d5, but yeah, that's pretty awful. He should try and close the position with f5, but white is obviously better here. Rook d3 is a nice move, hitting the queen. But queen d5 is just terrible. Now, black's position is falling apart. After this, it's absolutely deadly. The rook attacks this. And rook d1 is a very clean move, just pinning, and, well, with one of these pawns going through, white is going to win a piece. So this is how the game ended. One last trick, shouldn't play rook takes knight because a check and queen will level things up, but instead knight e5 is a very strong move. And knight d7 is the end of the show. If rook takes knight, then that's a queen, and the rook takes care of this pawn. Pawn goes through. So Jobava made it through in the end, but that was the longest of the tiebreak matches. Not an easy one for him. So there we go. He is rewarded for that victory with a pairing against Yu Yang in the next round. Not an easy one for him. Other very interesting pairings in round 2. We have Carlsen against Dreyev. He's not to be underestimated. Dreyev is incredibly experienced. We have an all-India matchup. We have Hari Krishna against Sethuraman. We have Aronian against Ho Yifan, and we have Wei Yi against Rapport, and many other matches as well. So round 2, game 1 tomorrow. Do join me.